Hey everybody, it's Alex Meller at Capnion here. I've seen a lot of people, talked to a lot of people about generative AI. You're asking the question, what does this really cost? And I agree that's a great question. My thesis that I'm repeatedly trying to share with you is that it's unusually important to clarify exactly what you want to do and how you want to do it because generative AI can be amazingly cheap in 2023 and it can also get really, really expensive on you if you put a whole lot of guardrails and conditions on how you want to do it. So in a minute, I have a retrieval augmented generation widget you can play with over the web, and I'll give you some tests that will hopefully enlighten you. And the point is that I built this thing on the cheap, and to some degree, you get what you pay for. One of the criteria is performance, and I'll get into that in a second. But first, I'd like to rewind. I remember something from high school I actually think is very relevant. So, my high school chemistry teacher did a good job of convincing me why you need to worry about significant figures. And if you don't remember your chemistry, who cares? But the story is if you sent like a request for work to some machine shop and you said, I want a 1 meter piece of metal, that costs a certain amount. And then if you say you want a 1.0 meter piece of metal, that costs a slightly larger amount, assuming everybody's on the same page. And the real danger is that you could say you want a 1.000 meter piece of metal, and as you add zeros, you're suggesting to that machine shop that they need to be very, very precise, and being very, very precise is expensive. So, in principle, if you add enough zeros, you should expect the cost to basically go to infinity. And I think this is a great metaphor for some phenomena around generative AI right now. If you need a 1.0 meter piece of metal, that's really cheap. If you need a 1.0 piece of metal, that's very expensive, and you really need to know which it is, and then budget for it correctly, ask for it correctly, or you're going to be hurting. All right, so this is, you might say, a Dungeons and Dragons toy. I'm going to use it to illustrate some things. If you're a Dungeons and Dragons fan, you know that you're supposed to pick a character class and a name, and you start out in a tavern somewhere looking for adventures. So I'm going to be a cleric named Bob. Bob is a very moral person. Gotta wait a second. Okay, so we're in the tavern now. And the point of this widget is that you can gossip with the tavern keeper and they might remember. So you can gloat about your exploits and they might tell somebody else. You can ask about somebody else's exploits and they might remember. And this is a form of retrieval augmented generation in that the memory of the tavern keeper is essentially a vector database. And when you try to talk to the tavern keeper about something, that vector database is going to put whatever you said into a vector embedding. And then the vector database is going to find past conversation that the tavern keeper has been in. The actual text is just the Chat GPT API with a lot of prompting to get it to function like a dungeon master would if you were just at the kitchen table with your friends. So I have a good example for you to play with. So I went to a lot of trouble to gossip to the tavern keeper about Tortillon, the renowned bard, defeated the infamous wizard Grokton on a Thursday in sunny June in the town of Easterdown. If you ask some questions of the bartender right now, and I have not yet had any conversation with the bartender about this, they will remember. So I'm going to tweak this sentence just a tiny bit. Who was the renowned bard who defeated the infamous wizard Grokton on a Thursday in sunny June in the town of Easterdown. Wait just a second. And they know, because I yesterday was in this imaginary AI bar talking to the bartender about the exploits of a renowned bard who defeated an evil wizard. But this is not going to function as well if I ask a question that includes too few of these details about Thursday in sunny June. So, who defeated Brockton? Let's see what we get here. Now it doesn't have enough. When it goes into that vector embedding, without the Thursday and the sunny June and the Easterdown, it's not going to pull the right stuff from the vector database. And it's not going to get the right stuff in the part of the process when it goes to the ChatGPT API. And I've got ChatGPT in a mode where it's supposed to be telling me a story, so it's going to make stuff up, aka hallucinate. And I would encourage you to play with this. The link is there. I'll put it in the comments. At least for a week, I'll make sure it's available for you. Tell it how cool you are, and then come back later and see if the bartender remembers. And if you speak in a very similar manner and include very similar details, the bartender will remember that you're very cool and will repeat back whatever reasons that you gave that you're super cool. What's the point here? This was made super cheaply with other people's tools. It has flashes of brilliance, but doesn't work very well. There's a whole lot of work, which inevitably is equivalent to money, that I could put into this and make it better. How good does it need to be? It's also the case that this particular widget is slanging data all over the universe. There's the server that hosts just the web app. It's sending data to the Open AI, ChatGPT AI, which is somewhere else at a different company. And then the vector database is Pinecone via an API over the web as well. So data is going to 3 different places across 3 different companies, which might not be okay with you if you have sensitive data that needs to be in your data center and nowhere else, or some sort of similar story. So, to review some of my past conversations, there's data privacy issues, there's infrastructure issues, and there's quality control issues. I already sort of indicated that the vector embedding piece here, it's not unlimited in its ability to pull the right stuff. Put a tiny bit of work into refining that to get it working well enough to show to you. I could put in a whole lot more work. And honestly, like if I could make my own vector embedding only for Dungeons and Dragons, but that would be a really, really heavy lift. So it's much like the chemistry thing of how accurate does it need to be relative to you needed to have some very particular behavior. If it's forgiving, you can do stuff very cheap. If it needs to be really perfect, you're sliding into essentially reinventing the wheel in a slightly different shape, and that can be very expensive. If I couldn't send the data to those foreign APIs, I would have to do a lot of other different stuff, which, A, that's going to be time for some engineer or for me. Money. Just in general, all the different things I did building this quick and dirty, if I can't do it like that more, it's going to get more expensive. So please play with this. Please think about your own project. Is it all the way nailed down? How well it needs to work? Do you have a lot of guardrails on data? Do you not? And when you're thinking about this cost question, I think it's really, really important to know whether you need a 1 meter piece of metal or a 1.00 piece of metal meter piece of metal, because the cost can swing an awful lot from amazingly little to an amazingly huge amount. And or in the end, the thing is disappointing and it just doesn't work quite well enough, and that's a drag. The most expensive project you can have is one that doesn't work in a way. So I hope this is helpful. I've noticed a lot of people out there are trying to ask these cost questions and answer them, and I think they're unusually subtle, and you should take unusual care.